The first sound was a hard, surprising thud against the oak-paneled wall, wood meeting flesh with the dull, sickening authority of something that should not have happened inside a courthouse. The room inhaled as one, a rustle of papers, a dozen phones lifting in unison, a child's muffled cry from the public gallery. A man in uniform had crossed the aisle in 3 steps, and his hand was on Chief Clare Bryant before anyone registered his intent. His palm shocked the breast of her blazer, fingers splayed like a claim. "Order!" Judge Price's voice detonated, short and legal, and flung between the tall pilasters. The pounding in Clare's ears answered it, a pulse she knew to read. She felt the weight of him, the inertia of muscle and entitlement, then the sudden, practiced restraint of deputies closing in. The officer's face was red with more than exertion, his jaw worked. Words spilled out, rough, shoving aside civility. Clare registered the shape of them without meaning to, a phrase of contempt directed at the hearing, at her, at every person who had sat so far through evidence. She had trained to parse threats into actionable data. She catalogued the shove as assault, the sound of the gallery as rising danger, the phones as witnesses. A deputy by the door moved like someone who had rehearsed restraint. He took the officer's arm and turned him away from Clare just as the judge's gavel scraped the desk and then struck empty air. For a breath, the room sat on the punctuation point between violence and response. Then the flood. Murmurs, reporters shudder forward, a woman in the 3rd row reaching blindly toward a trembling boy. A camera phone panning wildly and catching the moment on a blue-lit screen that would live off that light for days. Clare's body answered with the coolness of training. Her shoulders steadied, she stepped back so the deputies had room. She did not lurch or raise her voice. She felt, acutely, and with the private vertigo of someone who spends days mapping other people's crises, the eyes cataloging her. The camera people, the press, the union reps clustered at the back, Captain Winter's tight, controlled face, Derek Harrison's clenched fists disappearing behind a deputy's shoulder. Daniel Cooper, a county clerk who had been handling exhibit files at the front table, already had his phone out. Not for the phone's sake, because he knew, and because, like all bureaucrats turned witnesses, he had been waiting for a single, unassailable tableau that would change the shape of argument. "It will be noted in the record," Judge Price said, voice steadier now. "This hearing is adjourned until security matters are addressed." Her hand lingered on the docket, a testament to procedure that wouldn't let the moment dissolve into rumor. The bailiff moved to shield the bench. Outside the glass doors, the courthouse's fluorescent lights threw skin flat and clinical. Inside, the air smelled faintly of floor polish and coffee. The moment was already bifurcating. The kinetic event everyone had felt, and the slower work that Clare knew would follow. Filing, verification, chain of custody, public framing. She felt a twinge across her chest where the man's hand had struck her, a bruise blooming like a slow, private ledger. It would not be the immediate thing people cared for. People would note the spectacle first, but bruises were facts too. So was the footage now spinning across a dozen social platforms. Daniel was already looking at her, the way someone looks at a superior with a plea carved thin in their expression. "Chief," he mouthed, and in the way of people who decide on small acts of courage in the hush between orders, he slipped his phone under the table toward her. On the screen, the clip looped, grainy at the edges but unmistakable. Harrison crossing the aisle, the shove, the flinch, the deputy's arms. In the top corner, a timestamp. In the metadata, a trail. Clare took the phone with 2 fingers. The room was a study in movement around her. Amanda Foster, seated at the council table for internal affairs, had pushed from her chair and was already tugging open a manila folder behind her briefcase. Amanda's hands trembled only a fraction. She was, at this moment, a treasurer of records. Amanda had, for months, kept a file, small, careful, like a woman stashing seeds for a future spring. The folder's label read, in a hand that had been copied and recopied to avoid detection, "Foster, IA Notes." It contained audio transcriptions, body cam stills, a list of officers and dates, notations on missing reports. It was the engine Clare had been building toward without promissory notes. Corroboration. Outside the courthouse, the plaza was already swelling. Someone in a suit pressed a press release into a reporter's hand. A protester with a cardboard sign began to chant that clean, recognizable line: "Sunlight as disinfectant," ironically borrowed from the civic lexicon and meant now as moral injunction. In the precinct, Captain Winters put one hand to his forehead and let it rest there, as if to weigh the moment for damage control. He had a mind for containment. He had never believed containment should ever be used to hide real harm. If containment had a moral valence to him, it was to preserve the unit's function by any legal means necessary. Clay stepped down from the witness vantage of those who occupy power. She had been an FBI civil rights investigator once. She still held the cadence of that work in her bones. She listened for the things others missed: the murmur of counsel conferring at the back table, the tightness in Maxwell Bennett's jaw as he took in the swirl, the precise knock of a camera case closing as a freelance videographer realized his footage would now be evidence, not merely spectacle. She counted the witnesses who might corroborate, the deputies who would give statements, the union's reaction time. "You're all right?" Amanda asked, voice low. She didn't wait for an answer, and in the hush between heartbeats, slid the folder toward Claire. The papers inside smelt faintly of copier toner and late nights. Witness lists, redactions, a spreadsheet of incidents arranged like a ledger, dates and notations where reports had been lost or altered. Amanda had been the one to flag a pattern: use of force incidents rising in neighborhoods where complaints were regularly downgraded to resisted arrest, and then the attempts to bury the names. She had kept the archive because she had believed someone would one day follow the paper trail. Claire read the topmost sheet, fingers ghosting the type. There were entries for Marcus Johnson: 2 detentions in a single month, with injuries noted in medical files and nullified in departmental reports. There were notes on Elena Rodriguez, a teacher whose civil suit had been quietly settled, her name archived under job termination settlement. There was Sarah Williams, her child's name redacted in a victim impact statement a lawyer had tried to keep sealed. Each line was a small violence. The weight of them, stacked, made a new thing of the room, not a singular outburst by a furious man, but a pattern layered like a sediment. "We need the master files," Claire said, not because she wanted vindication, but because she knew how evidence spoke. Chain of custody on Daniel's clip, forensics on body cam logs. "Nathan, can you access the evidence locker from here?" Nathan Woods, a lean, anxious evidence technician who had seen how small things, an unlogged SD card, a mislabeled exhibit, could shift the balance, nodded. He had keys, passwords, and a conscience about his work that had lately frayed at the edges. He also knew how to make copies without leaving fingerprints in places that did not show them. Outside, the first of the social posts blurred across consoles, clips of the shove with captions rendered in righteous fury. The algorithm rewarded spectacle. The narrative rewarded outrage. The union's message arrived in minutes: procedural protest, the right to due process, the valorization of officers' service. Thomas Bradley, the union president, activated predictable defenses: call for restraint, call for the presumption of innocence. Maxwell Bennett whispered into a phone, plotting motions, frame-by-frame assessments of liability. From the other side, community organizers texted for a press conference and for the names of witnesses. They demanded transparency in language sharpened by months of patience. Claire felt the domestic edges of the job fold in. She had mothers to talk to, forms to sign, a bureau report due that afternoon. She had, as always, the peculiar loneliness of someone who must be both executive and investigator. She was not naive to politics. She understood that cameras could both illuminate and distort. But she also understood the arithmetic of cumulative proof. One shove in a crowded courtroom could be a spark, or, if mishandled, a smudge that left everything unclear. The difference would be in the chain of custody, and in how many people could say, in sworn statements, that this had happened before. Daniel had gone pale. "They pushed me earlier," he said, and the words came out in the small, stunned cadence of someone who had expected to do paperwork, not to be part of a scandal. At the clerk's window, Harrison shoved a folder, said I'd take too long. I kept the video because, he swallowed, because I didn't trust what would happen if it went through the normal channels. In moments like this, the ordinary acts of preservation felt almost holy. Nathan took Daniel's phone and, with a technician's steadiness, made an image copy, uploaded it to a secure drive, and ejected the physical file with the tenderness of someone who had handled evidence of greater tragedies. Amanda moved to give the clerk instructions, whispering protocols for preserving metadata and for not speaking to reporters without counsel. The gestures were small and exacting, breath and work. Harrison was now led from the room, handcuffed at the wrists. He had been an emblem of the precinct's ferocity, a man who had been praised for quickness in arrests and had accrued commendations that, to Clare's trained eye, often coincided with neighborhoods where complaints had been smoothed away. He said nothing as they passed, his eyes hard and unreadable. Clare felt the old professional curiosity. What had pushed him to that physical breach in a room that had been legally cocooned? She traced the moment in fragments. The petitions filed, the transcripts that painted a different man than the one in his personnel file. By evening, the footage, Daniel's clip, layered over longer body cam recordings obtained by Amanda's quiet requests, had been uploaded to a secure server and duplicated to multiple drives. Nathan signed off on a chain of custody log and pounded a final stamp with a heavy fist. The files were labeled with the kind of bureaucratic sobriety that belied their consequence. Exhibit A, Courtroom Incident. Exhibit B, Supplemental Body Cam. Exhibit C, Pattern Report. They were, by design, antiseptic and unlovely, boxes that would be opened in a hearing room under oath. At Clare's apartment, the city lights spilled thin and indifferent through the blinds. She sat at her small kitchen table with a chipped mug cooling half full. A photograph of her sister and a nephew laughed from the frame, like family in a less complicated world. She placed the phone on the table and watched the footage again, slower, looking for the moments the human eye can miss in spectacle. A wink of complicity between officer and captain in the first row of a roll call video. A misfiled incident report that should have appeared in an internal review but had been rerouted to miscellaneous. The soft sound, in a clip from a year prior, of an officer saying, in an exasperated hush, that "we'll handle it, don't make it public." Those items, disparate alone, had a way of finding one another when laid out in the order of dates and names. She imagined the hearing resumed. Testimony on the record, motions and objections. Bennett's practiced insistence on rules of evidence. The judge's crisp. She imagined victims called to the stand, their voices steadier than anyone expected, offering the human cost of reports that had been dismissed. Elena Rodriguez, in Clare's mind, was not a ledger entry, but a woman who had come to testify about a night that cost her a job and a sense of safety. Marcus Johnson was a young man who had lost time, work, stability. Sarah Williams's child woke at night now. Sarah could not sleep while the city called itself secure. These human stories were the mortar behind the files. On Clare's phone, a message from Amanda arrived, Secure Cloud Link. 2 sentences. I've cross-checked. There's an anomaly in the IA log, entries missing between March and June last year. I flagged it. Meet at the precinct, 11. Clare typed back a single word. On my way. She rose, the bruise along her ribs a private map, and pulled on her coat. The sun, when it rose the next morning, caught on the courthouse's stone facade and turned it gleaming, an indifferent, literal sunlight that the protest signs would borrow for metaphor. For now, it simply revealed dust in the mortar joints, flashing, as Clare had once said half-ironically to a colleague, the things people think they can hide under fluorescent light. She had always believed that exposure, methodical and legal, was a disinfectant. It was less a sermon than a tactic. Paper presented, witnesses sworn, patterns established. The shove in the courtroom had been a moment of rawness. Its power would depend on whether the people who had seen it could be turned into a coherent argument that courts and public opinion would not easily ignore. In the precinct's evidence room, Nathan plugged the duplicate footage into a workstation that hummed like a careful animal. He cross-referenced timestamps, he pulled manifest logs, and compared badge scan records. Somewhere between the footage and the log, a sliver of inconsistency blinked. A patrol car's GPS logged a route that did not match an officer's written statement. It was small, the kind of slip clerks chase like echoes, but small slips made ladders to larger truths. Nathan leaned forward, the glow of the monitor painting his cheekbones. He felt the old fear of retribution, the thin calculus, job security versus conscience, that had kept him quiet in the past. This time he thought of the clerk's phone and the gavel that had hung in silence. He hit export and encrypted the file. At the Union Hall, Thomas Bradley convened a late-morning call with counsel. "Procedural overreach," he told Maxwell Bennett, voice flat with the practiced cadence of defense. "We're coordinating legal representation. No media statements beyond the fact. We do not want to inflame the situation." His words were strategic, meant to cage the narrative. Yet even he could not fully control the feed of the plaza, or the clip that spread across feeds with a speed that made policy memos feel like artifacts of another age. Claire met with Amanda in a back office lined with binders. The two women, different in bearing and in the choices that had placed them inside the system, shared a quiet understanding. Amanda slid a binder forward. Redactions, annotations, a list of names she had not trusted to release from her desk. "I stayed," Amanda said simply. "I thought I could change it from inside. I didn't like what that meant." Her confession was neither plea nor apology. It was a statement of survival and of bargain. Claire put a hand over Amanda's on the table. "We keep this honest," she said. "We document. We protect who needs protecting. We follow procedure so the law can't be twisted." Her voice was not triumphalist. It was judo, using the system's processes against the forces that had exploited them. They spent the rest of the day building a timeline. Dates were pins like small flags. The night Elena's complaint was downgraded. The unlogged hours in Harrison's duty roster. The settlement that had removed Sarah's name from public files. A map of the precinct's interactions formed. Columns of misconduct reports beside columns of administrative decisions. They were inventorying patterns, not just exceptions. That evening, in a small coffee shop that smelled of roasted beans and municipal fatigue, Claire met with Marcus. He spoke with the careful cadence of someone rebuilding the edges of a life. "I lost a month of work," he said. "I missed rent. My mother called me and wanted to know what I had done. People judge easier than they investigate." His hands were steady now. He had given a statement and had decided to testify. "I don't want revenge," he added. "I want people to stop feeling like this is just how it is." Claire listened and thought of the courthouse again, of a moment where an officer's palm had been an enunciation of culture. She thought of how fragile reform was, how it required not only evidence but stamina. The files, the footage, the witnesses would form the scaffolding. Public trust and oversight would be the labor that ascended it. She knew there would be calls for immediate punitive action, but she also knew that the most durable outcomes were slow, indefinite, procedural. Justice, in her experience, was rarely cinematic. It was plumbing, persistent, often unseen, necessary. When Daniel walked back into the precinct that night, his face had a new tautness, like a person who had traded ignorance for purpose. He handed Claire a small envelope. Inside was a printed copy of his clip and a note, backed up in 3 drives, cleared with Nathan. He had spoken with a lawyer pro bono and had been advised on how to stay safe. The note was small but vital, an act of documentation and of transferring risk from an individual to a chain. Outside, protesters shouted into the dark, voices lifting and then settling into the patient rhythm of a city that had learned to make trouble a civic habit. The cameras showed faces that would become familiar. A teacher with a cardboard sign, a woman in a hospital scrubs uniform, an elderly man with a placard that read simply, "Accountability." The sunlight metaphor would be repeated in op-eds and tweets, but for Claire it remained a practical image. Exposure matched with procedural rigor could cleanse patterns of concealment. She returned to her apartment and opened the folder Amanda had given her one more time. The pages rustled, a sound of proof and burden. She set the files next to the phone with Daniel's clip and, with quiet hands, uploaded them to a secure cloud repository she had authority to access. She encrypted, she timestamped, she duplicated. For all the spectacle that had sprung from a shove in a courtroom, the work to make it matter would be done in these deliberate, often invisible acts. Saving a file, notarizing a copy, placing an exhibit on the record where it could not be quietly unmade. As she closed the laptop, Clare thought of the night before, of the judge's gavel, of the hush that had held the room suspended. She thought of how quickly public attention could morph into noise, and how slowly institutions could change. She put the files in the cloud, breath steady, and made one last call to the district attorney's office to arrange a secure briefing. The DA's aide agreed to a referral review. She slept little that night. When dawn leaked under the slatted blinds, the world outside was already arranging itself for the damage and for the work. There would be interviews, motions, union pushback, and, she knew, threats. Someone had already scrawled an anonymous message on the precinct's public bulletin board, "Stay out of our way." She read it with the patient calculation of someone who knew threats were signaling not just anger, but the stakes of change. At 10, a city reporter called requesting comment. At 11, Amanda and Clare walked into the precinct's internal affairs office where Nathan had set up a small command of screens. The archive Amanda had kept was now a hub. Names were cross-checked against payroll, GPS logs, cell tower pings, and internal memos. Each time a line connected, timestamp to badge scan, report to medical note, the architecture around misconduct showed a fracture. They had an early list of witnesses: a neighbor who had filmed an arrest outside an apartment unit, a bystander who had taken a photograph of an officer's belt cam in a scattered pile, a janitor who remembered seeing an officer shove a complainant into a cruiser. Each witness was both evidence and a person whose life would be disturbed by the attention of the media and the union. Amanda drew up witness protection suggestions and a plan for anonymity where possible. Clare approved. The human cost of truth-telling was never absent. By mid-afternoon, the clip had been verified by forensics, duplicate sealed, and a formal referral to the district attorney prepared. The DA's office would open a preliminary review. They would decide whether to pursue criminal charges. Simultaneously, an administrative hearing would be scheduled to examine pattern evidence and disciplinary measures. Clare felt the balance of the two processes like walking on two parallel tracks. The city needed both to tilt the institution away from its old defaults. The precinct, meanwhile, was a furnace of politics. Captain Winters convened a meeting with his lieutenants. "We will cooperate with process," he said in a voice that tried for neutral but carried under it the weight of someone balancing loyalty and survival. He met with Maxwell Bennett that evening in a room with a rolled map of the precinct on the wall. Bennett's advice was surgical: how to argue intent, how to question chain of custody, how to delay. Delay, Bennett said, is a kind of defense. It allows cooling and reassessment. He was not passionate beyond his craft. He was a man who discursively served those who could pay. Clare returned home and found a message from Marcus. He would testify. Elena's lawyer wanted to know whether the chief would coordinate with victims' counsel. Sarah's caseworker had a list of dates where her child's therapy would be available to testify about trauma's ripple. There were also threats, anonymous calls, an unmarked envelope at Nathan's locker containing a photograph of his house. The work of change had the predictable side effect of hardening adversaries. She looked again at the clip. The officer's hand landed where it did. The judge's red face remained a picture of institutional alarm. The gallery's phones recorded it all. In that small, crystallized instance, the city could choose to look away or to reckon. Clare had no illusions. Reform would be slow, contested, and incomplete. But she also had a conviction, shaped by years of civil rights work. When evidence was collected with care and presented with integrity, the law could be a lever. She saved Amanda's archive, backed up Nathan's exports, and sent the files to a secure attorney who specialized in civil rights referrals. The next steps would be hearings, motions, and months of litigation. But for now, there was an immediate tactical decision to make: whether to release the clip publicly on the precinct's portal to preempt leaks, or to hold it within discreet legal channels. Amanda argued for internal control to preserve chain of custody. Clare weighed the public demand for transparency against legal strategy. Outside, the plaza that had seen the first protests began to organize. Community leaders planned a forum. A rally would convene at noon, right in front of the courthouse where the shove had been caught. The sunlight, literal now, hit the steps and made the stone a bright stage. For journalists, the narrative was clear and consumable. For Clare, the work remained the same: collect, verify, press forward methodically. The shove had been the spectacle. The task was to translate spectacle into sustained accountability. She dialed the DA's aide again and left a succinct message: referral delivered, we have corroborating exhibits, and a verified body cam sequence. We will coordinate witness scheduling. Please prepare for public statements. When she hung up, the phone felt heavy in her hand. Procedural work felt, sometimes, like shoveling a foundation. No matter how visible the shove became, the city would be judged by what it built afterward. At noon, as the crowd assembled and chants thickened into a single instrument of urging, Amanda leaned across the evidence table and whispered, "There are more files." She pushed a small battered USB toward Clare, a repository of internal emails and a redacted list of incidents that had been documented but never surfaced in public. Amanda's voice did not carry triumph. "I couldn't get them out before," she said. "I was afraid. But I couldn't stay silent when last night happened." Clare took the drive and felt the gravity of a new turn in their work. There were risks to Amanda: career, safety, social ostracism, but there were also suddenly more threads to follow. She thought of the judge's gavel, hung metaphorically above the city, and of the cameras that now recorded not just a shove, but a pattern. The public hearing would have the spectacle, yes, but if they unfolded the evidence with care, the spectacle could become a pivot point. She slipped the USB into her pocket like a talisman and stood to go meet the DA's team. Outside, the plaza chants rose and fell like a sea. The sunlight met stone. People lifted signs and cameras. The shove in the courtroom had been the moment that left everyone speechless. What Clare could not know in that charged, raw hour was whether the city's long procedural gears would grind toward reform or toward a new pattern of containment dressed as accountability. She walked toward the courthouse and, as she went, her mind tabulated the next moves. Witness protection for Daniel, legal counsel for Nathan if threats escalated, a motion to seal evidence until the DA prepared charges, coordination with victim advocates. The files in Amanda's folder felt like a map with the right roads highlighted. The manila envelope, the cloud backups, the encrypted drives, all of it would be proof only if it could be presented under oath without being discredited. At the court steps, a woman held up a placard with the sun's image crudely painted in yellow. It read, "Sunlight, not enough." Clare paused and watched, not for metaphor, but for the people behind the sign. Faces, stories, the quiet rage that had been organized into civic habit. She had promised herself, in a different life, that she would be an instrument of procedural clarity. Now, standing with the crush of people on the courthouse steps and the weight of evidence in her pocket, the promise felt real in an ordinary, dangerous way. She answered one last text before stepping inside. Elena's confirmation that she would testify, a short message of trembling courage. Clare thumbed a reply: support, logistics, a promise to meet before testimony to go over procedure and safety. Then she crossed the threshold into the building again, the doors closing with a small, resolute thud behind her. The hearing would reconvene. The cameras would be present. The union would mobilize its legal arsenal. But there was now a repository of facts, handled correctly, that might translate the spectacle into a case the city could not ignore. Clare walked into the hearing room with the list of names and the files pressed like keys in her coat pocket, ready to open doors that had been shut for too long. She could not promise a tidy victory. She could promise, with the steadiness she had cultivated, that she would follow the documents, the witnesses, and the law wherever they led. The shove had been an eruption. Now the patient work of translating eruption into reform began. She took a breath and stepped forward into the courtroom light. The room smelled of old varnish and cheap coffee. The dais was ringed with microphones. The oversight board's seal glittered under the lights. Reporters elbowed for angles. The crowd beyond the gallery pressed forward, a mesh of anger and expectation. Clare found a seat near the DA's table and set her hands on the folder where Amanda's drive had been logged into evidence by the aide. The aide, young, competent, eyes already lined with too many late hours, nodded once, then slipped away to confer with Priya Desai, the district attorney. Chairman Villar rapped the gavel. "We will come to order," he said, voice steady but small against the weight of the room. "We will hear from the Office of Police Oversight and from the District Attorney's Office. As a reminder, this hearing is recorded and broadcast. Civility will be maintained." Helen Cross, the union counsel, sat poised as if carved from stone. She wore a navy suit that made her look calibrated for courtroom motion. Beside her, Captain Morales, an internal affairs stand-in chosen for the occasion, kept his jaw set as if bracing for a blow. Priya stood and walked to the microphones with a file tucked to her side. She did not preen for the cameras. The DA did not need flourish. Her presence was its own argument. "Chairman, members of the board," Priya said, "the office has received new material relevant to the incident under review. We have authenticated a body-worn camera sequence that corroborates key witness testimony, and we are currently reviewing additional records supplied to us this morning. Because of the sensitivity of those records, and to protect the integrity of a potential criminal proceeding, we will ask the board to consider a motion later to temporarily seal portions of the public record tied directly to that evidence." A collective intake of breath. From the back of the room, someone shouted, "Don't hide it!" A sign behind the press said in jagged marker, "Sunlight not enough." Villar held up a palm. "We will discuss any motion when it is properly moved. Ms. Desai, can you?" "Yes," Priya said. "We will proceed with public testimony and will not delay the public's right to know. But if there is a criminal inquiry that could be compromised by the premature release of files, by which I mean files that contain investigative leads, witness identities, or unredacted internal communications, we will petition the court to seal those specific records while maintaining a summary for public consumption." Helen Cross hardened. "With all due respect, Miss Desai," she said, the tone of one who measures consequences, "we cannot have the office of the district attorney decide what the public is entitled to see in a hearing convened by an elected body. That would be a dangerous precedent for executive control over legislative hearings." Clare watched Priya's jaw flex. The DA did not need to make an adversarial show. She simply replied, quietly, "We understand the board's authority. We only request prudence to prevent witness intimidation and to preserve the evidentiary value of material that must later be produced under oath. We will move as fast as the law allows." Villar consulted his notes. "We will hear first from the victim," he said, "Miss Elena Morales." Across the gallery, Elena stood, assisted by two advocates. Her hands shook as she approached the podium, a tremor that belonged to a person who had been asked to make her heart legible in public. She wore a plain blouse and a jacket someone had lent her. The room leaned in. Elena's voice at first was a small thing, like a glass set on a table. "My name is Elena Morales," she said. "I am here to tell you what happened to me so it does not happen to someone else." She described the protest, the swirl of bodies, the heat of it. She described the first encounter with the officers as procedural, orders, crowd control. But then a man in uniform approached in a manner she found aggressive. "I told him I was leaving," she said. "I moved my hands away. He pushed. I fell. He pushed again. I don't remember everything. I remember the pain later. I remember waking up with my face bright with blood." The room was patient for a beat, collecting itself. Elena's words were not constructed for effect. They were a ledger of sensations. Cameras panned.
Someone in the gallery sobbed. "Did you see the officer's badge number?" Villar asked. "I tried," Elena said, "but they had shields that blocked every angle. I saw someone lifting a hand. It was too fast." "Was any force justified?" asked a board member, a lawyer with a tendency to drill. "Did you resist lawful orders?" Elena looked toward Clare for an instant, then back to the dais. "I did not resist," she said. "I asked to leave. I said I was going home. I was shoved. People behind me saw. Cameras saw." Priya rose. "With the board's leave, we would like to play the body-worn camera footage," she said. Cross protested at once. "We should have a chance to review any footage before playback," she said. "Due process requires a review." Miss Cross.
"We can provide counsel with time to review a copy," Priya answered. "But this footage is already in our possession and is central to the public's understanding of the incident." Villar glanced at his colleagues. There were murmurs, some for immediate transparency, others for restraint. "We will allow a brief review by counsel at the table," he decided. 15 minutes. Be quick." Clare stepped away to the DA's table. The aide slid a tablet across to Priya, who tapped it and watched the first frames. The body cam showed crowds, closely packed, a police line advancing. For a second, the image was noise, arms, protested signs, then a shove happened. A hand coming from behind an officer's shoulder, a woman stumbling forward. The camera swinging as people reacted. It was not the long cinematic shove some had accused. It was a spatially compressed burst of force that nonetheless carried a clarity, a deliberate thrust, an extension of torso and arm, the victim displaced. At the edge of the room, Amanda stood, hands clenched at her sides. Clare saw her only as a silhouette and understood the risk she had taken to hand over the files. Amanda had refused interviews. She had refused the lights. She had simply done what she thought right and then gone back to her life. Seeing her there felt like catching a match someone had lit and was now trying not to set their sleeve on fire. When the footage was played, the gallery breathed. You could hear the collective realization sweep through people like wind across an open plain. Someone's phone chimed. A camera shutter clicked. Helen Cross pivoted. "We will move to exclude," she announced, "on the grounds of authenticity and chain of custody. Where did this footage originate? Who maintained it? If it is a government file, who had access?" Priya had anticipated the question. She turned and met Clare's eyes for a moment. Clare nodded subtly. "The footage is from a department-issued body-worn camera," Priya said. "It was reviewed by our office and matched against contemporaneous dispatch logs. We have taken custody with a verified chain of custody protocol. We are prepared to attest to authenticity." Cross's lips thinned. "Prepared, perhaps, but attestations are not proof," she said. "We will call for an independent forensic review should any punitive action be taken on the basis of this material." The board took testimony from the forensic analyst on the DA's team who explained the authentication process in spare terms. It was not cinematic, it was method. Hash signatures, timestamps, cross-referencing server logs. The more prosaic the explanations, the more devastating they felt. Authenticity in court was a kind of moral weight. To have a chain of custody was to make casual denials brittle. Then came the matter of Amanda's material. Priya disclosed, carefully with legal cadence, that additional emails and internal incident reports had been submitted to the DA's office earlier that morning via secured transfer. "Because of specifics contained therein," she said, "we will ask the board to allow certain documents to be discussed in closed session to avoid jeopardizing witness safety." Clare's hand in her coat was empty. Amanda's drive had been logged and transferred. But the public square demanded names and files. There was electricity in the contradiction. Villar moved the board toward a compromise. "We will recess into a closed session to hear about the materials that may affect the criminal investigation," he said. "We will allow the public hearing to continue with testimony and with a summary of any redacted items when appropriate." The room divided. Applause, boos, murmurings. Protesters outside beat their drums harder. Through a window, Clare could see a man putting up a sign, "Not another cover-up." She felt the press of the crowd as a presence even within the wood-paneled room.
In the closed session, Claire, Priya, and the DA's investigators screened the emails Amanda had delivered. They were not sensational in phrasing. They were the bureaucratic language of problem-solving. Incident reports with dates and times, entries tagged allegation excessive force, memos recommending administrative counseling, follow-up emails noting no further action. One thread in particular threaded across years. A supervisor's note, short, efficient, advising subordinates to manage narrative in the aftermath of protests. Another email had the corporate dryness of an instruction: avoid media until PR can issue a statement. There were entries documenting complaints that were routed into the system and then closed with improbable speed. "These are the patterns we feared," Priya said quietly. Taken individually, any one of these could be explained by clerical backlog. Taken together, with the body-worn footage and recent escalations, they show a departmental inclination to categorize and contain rather than investigate and correct. "Will you release them?" Claire asked. Her voice sounded like a ledger as well, an accountant of consequences. "We will not release them in unredacted form," Priya said. "But the board, in a closed session, can review and determine administrative remedies. For the criminal matter, we will present the relevant portions to a grand jury. We need to protect identities and ensure we do not create avenues for witness harassment." Claire understood the calculus. She also understood the political cost. Every request to seal was ammunition for those who would call the process secretive. Amanda's choice to provide the files had grown the stakes beyond a single hearing. It made the DA's discretion weighty. When the board returned to public session, news crawled across screens outside the chamber announcing that the DA had motioned to convene a grand jury. The statement was careful. It announced an intent to seek evidentiary grand jury review to determine whether criminal charges should be brought. Politically, it was a middle path, firm yet procedural. Elena was asked if she would be willing to cooperate further with the DA. She nodded. "I want them to be held accountable," she said. "Not just out here, but in court, where it matters." Outside, a chant rose, "Justice now." It was not rhetorical. It demanded time and outcome at once. Helen Cross erupted.
Into argument. "A grand jury will be a fishing expedition," she said. "This is a clear attempt at criminalization of policing actions in the line of duty." Priya met the accusation with a calm that folded like a blade. "This is an attempt to determine whether criminal conduct occurred," she said. "If the officers acted within the law, they will be cleared. If not, they will be held accountable. That is the function of our office." On the way out of the chamber, a counsel aide brushed against Claire and whispered, "There are rumors that a disciplinary hearing will be scheduled immediately. Suspension pending investigation." Amanda emerged from the gallery as if moving through a crowd of glass. Claire watched her approach, gloves on, breath fogging in the winter edge of the afternoon. Amanda's eyes were raw, as if she had not slept the night before. She did not look like someone searching for recognition. She looked instead like someone who had chosen a consequence. "Thank you," Claire said, when Amanda came within earshot. Amanda's lips twitched. "I thought about not giving them," she said. "I thought about what it would do to me. But then I thought about Elena, about Dan." "Daniel," Claire corrected. "He's being cared for." Amanda's jaw tightened. "I know. I couldn't stay quiet." Claire reached out, briefly, to grip her hand, an affirmation that had nothing to do with legal procedure. "You did the right thing," Claire said. "We will move carefully now." Outside the courthouse, the protest had swelled. News vans idled like compact stations. The city smelled of street food and winter air. Crowds chanted. Someone nearby unfurled a long banner. "Accountability. It's a choice, not a punishment." Claire took stock. The DA had what she needed to convene a grand jury. The oversight board had moved reluctantly toward administrative action. The union would litigate and obfuscate.
The city's machine would respond the way machines do, in small motions, recalculations, press statements. But circuits had been opened, evidence routed where it could no longer be quietly ignored. Her phone buzzed. Nathan's counsel had texted asking for dates, indicating whether an administrative suspension could be made public before formal charges. The message read like someone trying to script a defense out of irregularity. Claire considered the ethics and the optics. Priya would want to control the timing of announcements to prevent leaks that might endanger witnesses. The union would exploit any premature release to frame an injustice. She composed a measured reply. Coordinate with DA, do not comment publicly, any statements should be vetted through counsel. As she typed, a photographer with broad shoulders and a face like someone who angles for headlines angled his camera toward Amanda. The woman noticed and stepped behind a column. Two men in plainclothes lingered a few feet away and watched. Claire's throat tightened. Being a witness in a public theater came with shadows. That night, in a small room with whiteboards and legal pads, the DA's investigators plotted
The next moves. They would subpoena raw data from the department's internal systems, seek formal preservation orders to prevent spoliation, and file for a grand jury. Priority 1. Protect Daniel and Elena from contact and intimidation. Priority 2. Begin a limited set of administrative demands to the police department to remove officers from street duty pending review. Claire stayed late, drafting motions and witness lists. The files from Amanda spread like a map of choices. She wrote a list of people to interview: supervisors, dispatchers, medics, other protesters who were recorded on peripheral cameras. She flagged anomalies: a missing incident narrative for a date when a complaint should have been logged, an entry where an event had been tagged as resolved without follow-up. Each red flag was a possible thread to pull. At the bottom of the page she wrote a reminder in her own hand: protect voices, prioritize safety over optics. She ran through a rehearsal in her head for Elena's ongoing interactions with the press, what the DA could say, what the oversight board would release, and what the department's press office would do. There would be statements about deep concern, full cooperation, commitment to transparency. Words like that were hollow unless backed by action. Before she left the building, Priya approached her. "I will need you to walk me through Amanda's chain," Priya said. "We will need an attestation from you regarding how you receive the material and any custody transfers." Claire made a small, steady nod. "I will prepare a declaration," she said. "I'll detail the times, the transfers, and the encryption keys. I'll explain why Amanda couldn't come forward earlier." Priya's expression was almost private in the light. "We will also need to prepare for the possibility of a press leak," she said. "Someone will try to paint Amanda as a villain or an opportunist. We need to be ready to show the need for confidentiality, to keep witnesses safe." Claire thought of the crowd outside and of the sign that read, "Sunlight not enough." The phrase circled in her mind like a call. Amanda had chosen sunlight, the DA had chosen seal, and grand jury. The oversight board had chosen to weigh both. It was messy, which meant it was real. On the sidewalk, Amanda paused and looked back at the courthouse, as if trying to remember the weight of the steps. Claire noticed an unmarked van idling across the street, its windows dark. A man inside checked a screen, then rolled up his sleeve to show a tattoo that read, in blunt script, "Loyalty." It was the kind of thing that made thin the line between concern and threat. Claire walked Amanda toward the transit stop, then turned to leave. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Daniel's temporary guardian, a courtesy note that he had asked for a single thing: books to help him sleep. Claire smiled, but it had a tension under it. Daniel's safety was being managed in the short. The long term would be fought in rooms like the one she had just left. That night the city hummed, sirens somewhere, the late-night certainty of a place awake. In her apartment, Claire made tea and read through the emails one more time. There were small human details that amplified guilt. The supervisor who had started as an earnest cop and slid toward pragmatism. The training memos that emphasized crowd control at the expense of de-escalation. It was not simply malice. Often it was a culture that calcified into instructions.
Her phone pinged with a single incoming call from an unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. The message came later, short and mechanical. "We know what you did," a voice said, then a click. No other words. Claire sat with the device in her hand, the invisible weight of the thing both a warning and an indicator that the act of naming had shifted the chessboard. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she went to see Daniel. He was quieter than she had expected, as if the unmooring of his night had taken more from him than a single night's rest. He reached for a book she brought, an old paperback about sailors, and traced the spine with his index finger, as if counting the seasons it had survived. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He considered. "Not brave yet," he said, "but I'm not lying down." Claire thought that bravery was not a single thing, but often a small sequence. Stay, speak, survive. She sat with him, and they read a page or two, and there was a domesticity to it that felt like a promise that the effort might matter. Back at work, the DA filed the preservation orders and moved for the grand jury. The committee chair released a statement calling for reform of body cam policies, better management of complaints, and a temporary moratorium on certain crowd control tactics. The police department, through a terse spokesperson, announced cooperation but noted due process for its officers. The union filed a motion to quash any embargo on public documents and prepared a flurry of litigation talk: motions, hearings, subpoenas. The tactic was familiar: litigate to delay, to make an urgent demand into an administrative swamp. Claire sat through the storm like someone who had chosen to steer a rudder into a current. She knew there would be leaks and spin and the inevitable attempts to shape narrative. But she also saw, in the small evidentiary victories, authenticated footage, administrative memos that hinted at a pattern, Elena's willingness to testify, that the city's story had changed. Where before the shove had been a single violent event, now it lay in a frame with antecedents and responses. Patterns, once visible, demanded answers. On the third day, a district judge signed the DA's preservation requests. Priya called Claire at noon. "They've granted the order," she said. "Now we start the grand jury process next week. We'll need you to coordinate witness prep." Claire exhaled.
The sound felt like a small release. "I'll make the list," she said. "One more thing," Priya added. "Be careful. The voicemail you received could be an isolated nut or a signal. Either way, document everything. Tell Amanda to stay close to counsel. We'll request protective measures if we need them." Claire agreed. She thought of Amanda in the plaza with a sun-painted sign, and about the man in the van and the inked hand. The city had begun to move, but moving meant friction, and friction could make sparks. She walked out into the afternoon with a list of interviews in her head. The plaza below the courthouse still thrummed. Some crowds had become rituals of civic insistence. The shove had set a chain of procedural work into motion, but the chain would be judged by what it produced. Charges, reforms, nothing. Claire had no illusions that the work would be neat. It would be deliberate and slow and full of ruptures. As she passed a newsstand, someone waved a flyer. Amanda, hero or hack? And the question sat there like an old coin. Whatever the headlines would call her, Claire knew the human tally was different. It was the sum of choices made in a small room with an encrypted drive and the courage to deliver it. She turned her face to the cold and kept walking toward the office. There were names to call, depositions to schedule, and Elena to support. The legal gears were turning, and now the city's judgment would be a long project of seeing, testing, and, if the evidence held, holding to account those whose authority had been abused. When she reached the steps of the building where her team met, her phone vibrated again. This time the text was simple and precise. From Amanda. "I told a friend where I parked. If anything, watch for a van." No flourish, just a factual act of precaution. Claire typed, "Stay with counsel. We'll file for protective order. Do not go alone." Then she looked up at the courthouse where the dais had been that morning and felt the small, fierce truth that the work ahead would require procedural patience and moral insistence in equal measure. The city would test them. They would respond. The rest of it, Whether change would follow remained, for now, inside the files that had been handed over and the grand jury that would begin to ask questions.